You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. Wort tastes pretty good, but beer tastes quite a bit better, and brewers have a little fungus called yeast to thank for turning the former into the latter. Like all living organisms, yeast perform best under certain conditions, and while viability or the number of living cells in a pitch has been a major focus of brewers, there is another important aspect of yeast health. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this episode, I'm joined by contributor Cade Jobe to discuss the use of a vitality starter with yeast that's a bit old, particularly as it pertains to English porter.
Yeah, viable yeast are important, right? You need to have enough yeast that are there to be able to do the job of fermentation, but also equally important is yeast that are actually capable of doing the job of fermentation. So this whole vitality thing, right? Not just the number of yeast cells. If you have a whole bunch of yeast cells that aren't capable or aren't ready to do fermentation or survive in anaerobic or high alcohol conditions, they're not going to do what we want them to do. They're going to have trouble. They're going to spin out of control, and they're going to produce a whole bunch of things that we don't want in the beer. So vitality is important. But if you've got old yeast sitting around, what are you supposed to do? And maybe a vitality starter could be something to consider. We'll see when we get into the results.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the whole idea of a vitality starter is something that seems at least relatively common today. But up until sometime in, 2015, at least according to my memory, I'm not even sure if it was a term that brewers were terribly familiar with. I know that, vitality in general has been of focus to brewers, but this idea of a vitality starter and, trying to up the vitality of yeast. Well, since then, I've used them quite a bit, though I don't believe it's ever been with yeast that's a bit too long in the tooth. So I'm looking forward to chatting about this with you today, Cade. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you're going to receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. For March of 2023, the sensory manager at John I. Haas and Brewlosophy's resident sensory analysis expert Jeff Daly will be hanging out with patrons. Jeff has actually been a Q&A guest before. He is often a guest on the Brew Lab podcast with you, Cade, and his last Q&A session was really awesome. So we thought some of our newer patrons might enjoy hanging out with a professional in the world of hops and sensory analysis as well. To be part of this session, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, March 29th, 2024, as Jeff's session is scheduled for that Saturday, the 30th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron and check out all of the rewards we have to offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate that as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, they are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You're not going to be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run an amazing YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Tom Fricker from Lexington, Kentucky hit us up with some general feedback. Tom said, I've been brewing beer off and on for the last 25 years or so and wanted to reach out and thank you guys for the impact you've had on my brewing life. As a father of 2 young children and a husband to boot, finding time to brew while wrangling home life and working a full-time labor-intense job, I'm a grounds worker for the University of Kentucky, has been difficult, especially when I was spending 6 to 8 hours on a brew day back when I thought that was the only way to do it. I would try to to incorporate my brew days. I do, I do family time and involving my kids and wife as much as I could, but ultimately it was an uphill struggle. Equipment lay in the basement collecting dust. Kegerator empty. All work and no brew makes Tom an angry boy. Enter Brewlosophy. After discovering the podcast and going back and reading the back articles on the website, I was convinced I didn't need to follow the strict canon of 1 hour of this, 1 hour of that, plus, et cetera, et cetera. I loosened up brew, some short and shoddy, and cut my brew day down to 2 to 3 hours, including cleanup, and am making, in my opinion, some of the best beer I've made in my home brewing career. I'm now a patron and member of the brew club participating in the Average Brew series, and I am back in the swing of things. Kegerator is full. Tom is a happy boy.
I love these kinds of comments. They just make me smile as I read through them, right? I mean, that's so great, Tom. I'm glad that this has actually worked out for you. I can certainly understand, too, as a parent of 2 young kids and working and doing a job, and also going to school. Finding time to brew is difficult. And finding that hour, for mashing and an hour for boiling and then, cold lagering and all this kind of stuff. It takes a long time and takes a long time to get beer out into your kegerator to be ready to drink. So certainly the short and shoddy series and gelatin fining and all of the other things that we've done for time saving. I love those. And again, these just make me smile because that's exactly right. I started the same way as you doing, following the dogma, 60-minute mash, 60-minute boil, maybe even a 90-minute boil for lagers, right? Following all this dogma and then looking at the experiments and seeing that it may not matter has really opened my eyes. So cool, Tom. I'm glad that you're a happy boy, and I'm glad that you've got full kegerators full of beer and time to brew now.
That of beer that tastes good to him. I mean, that's the key, right? Is that by doing some of the stuff that we've experimented on, or actually not doing some of the things that you perhaps were trained to do in the beginning, you're still producing beer that you enjoy, you're happy about it, and that's what matters. Not what the schmuck at the homebrew club who's been brewing for 30 years says. Do what works for you and be happy with it. I think that's awesome. This is exactly the kind of feedback that just puts gas in my tank. It really does keep me wanting to continue doing this thing that we do. I absolutely love it, Tom, and I'm so glad that you've been able to re-experience this joy of homebrewing because of the silly stuff that we do for fun. What a rad story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, Tom. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. If you're not already subscribed to the Brewlosophy Show on YouTube, please go do it right now at youtube.com/@the Show. That's the @ symbol followed by the Brewlosophy Show with no umlauts. Martin really is producing some seriously fun content over there, and we are certain fans of this podcast are going to love it just as much as they enjoy hearing us babble on. All right, we'll be back with talk of using vitality starters with old yeast right after this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. You've heard the adage a million times, brewers make wort and yeast makes beer. That's probably because, well, it's true. As important as all of the stuff that goes into making wort is, from recipe design to the brewing process, fermentation is where the magic happens. It's where the sugary wort that we produce becomes delicious beer. And so it makes sense that brewers would pay so much attention to yeast. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of vitality in general, let's spend some time going over some basics to set a little bit of groundwork first.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think you've got to start by talking about what yeast is and what yeast does. I think everybody listening to this show hopefully knows that yeast is the one that consumes sugar and then makes alcohol and CO2 and a whole bunch of other little like flavor components as well, right? But that's kind of the main purpose of yeast. As we talk about a lot in the Brew Lab, though, there's a whole lot of other stuff that goes on and a whole lot of other things that are important to yeast. Like producing things like fatty acids can lead to formation of esters. If yeast is stressed, it doesn't spend as much time cleaning up its mess. So like all of these different pieces of yeast and what it does are super important. But like I just mentioned back at the top, the whole point of yeast is to take sugar and then produce alcohol and CO2. And it needs the right conditions to do that.
Yeah. Now, my understanding is that all yeast basically do this. This is a function of the fungus that we call yeast. But we have, over the years of making this deliciously malty and hoppy beverage that we all love so much, we have honed in basically one specific, there's a couple, but the primary one that we're referring to today is what we call brewer's yeast or Saccharomyces cerevisiae. There's also Saccharomyces pastorianus or Carlsbergensis. I think those are the same thing, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But those are going to be the two primary Saccharomyces strains that we are using to ferment wort, to turn wort into beer. They have an average attenuation of right around 75%, plus or minus 10% or so, which just means that the yeast is going to stop metabolizing that sugary wort at a point where there's still some remaining sugar in the liquid, and that's a good thing because that contributes flavor. It can help to contribute body and all of that stuff, and it's what we rely on that as a predictable measure, so that when we're designing a recipe, again, we know how big it's going to be, how thick it might be, stuff like that. So yeast is a very, very important part of the brewing process. It's an absolutely essential part of it. And so, like I said earlier, it makes sense that we're going to pay attention to it. And the biggest thing when it comes to yeast is the yeast health. We use that word kind of loosely, but by health, we're referring to a multitude of things that contribute to this yeast, basically its ability to fully perform in the way that we want it to perform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And, if you don't, right, like if you don't give yeast the ability to perform the way that we want it to perform, it won't.
It won't do it.
I mean, it won't. I mean, like you mentioned attenuation, right? And like how, average is like 75%. There's still some sugar left over. That can be one of two things, right? Some sugars are just too big, right? They just can't get inside the yeast cell. And so those sugars are obviously going to be left in the beer because the yeast can't consume it. It's like consuming a quadruple or heptuple cheeseburger, right? You just can't fit it in your mouth.
Challenge accepted, Cade. Challenge accepted, my friend.
I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that would try, but you just can't fit it in. So that could be one thing, is sugars that are just too big to fit into the yeast cell. But the other thing it could be is yeast just wasn't ready to go. It just wasn't hungry. It didn't have the energy to be able to process the sugars. So you have a whole bunch of leftovers that are just there that could have been turned into alcohol and CO2, but they weren't because the yeast wasn't ready.
Yeah.
Right. And so that yeast health is super important. And there's a lot of things that go into that, like nutrients and, like vitality and viability. Vitality are things that we're going to talk about. And then also, of course, pitch rate too, right? That's a big one.
Yeah. Let's focus a little bit on viability first, only because I know that that's the primary place where I think a lot of brewers were kind of guided to first focus on. I know it was for me. When we talk about viability, it's really not that crazy of a concept. All it is you take a given population of yeast. Viability refers to the number of living cells within that population of yeast. So, if you've got a 1 liter, of yeast, liquid yeast slurry, then when somebody gives you the viability reading, they're going to give you a percentage of the living cells to the overall cells that are in that population. And so when it comes to viability, one of the things we have to keep in mind is the changing viability that is impacted by the age of that population of yeast, right? So for us as homebrewers, what that looks like is for imperial yeast users, you're talking about a pouch. It might be a vial. I think everybody's moved into pouches these days nowadays, actually. So what we're looking at is how many living yeast cells are still remaining in that package. And there are some kind of predictive things that say that, in this amount of time, you're going to lose approximately this amount of viability. I'm not entirely sure what those numbers are, though. Cade, do you?
No, yeah, I think there's sort of just, it depends on the packaging conditions. It depends on how, the manufacturer itself. It depends on the viability of the yeast that are in the package, right? But for the most part, a good rule of thumb is this, or at least one that I've heard, is about 20% of those cells degrade each month. So like the easy way to think about this is when Imperial tells you that they pack 200 billion cells into a pouch, that means viable cells. That means 200 billion cells that can complete fermentation the way that you want it to. But the problem is that as soon as that pouch leaves the facility, then it starts to degrade. And the older it gets, the fewer viable cells are available. So let's say you had 200 billion cells in January, and then a month later, you want to brew in February. Well, now you've got 160 billion cells, and then so on and so forth. It goes down like 128 billion cells by March, and so on and so forth. Now, again, this is just sort of a rule of thumb. You can actually count cells if you want to. If you've got a microscope, you have interest in that. There's methods out there for doing it. Most home brewers aren't going to go that far, right? And I don't blame you, right? It's much easier to punch it into an online calculator, and that will work, right? The calculator in Brewfather works like that. There's online calculators where you punch in exactly, the initial concentration of cells, 200 billion in the case of Imperial, and then you punch in the date that it was manufactured, and it calculates to today's an estimate of how many cells are available in that package.
Right.
Now, this also matters because you need to know how many cells you're pitching into the wort. It's this whole concept of pitch rate. If you're pitching too few cells, then the cells are overly stressed because they're essentially stuck in all, they just kind of have a party and they go crazy and they go fast as they can and they don't clean up any of their mess. It's like having a rager, right? Like imagine like a Vegas hotel room on a bachelor party or something. It just like throws this huge party and you wake up the next morning and everything is a mess because it's just so much going on.
And you might have lost a little viability in your friend group. I mean, that's just the way it works when you go to Vegas.
That's true too. And you certainly lost your vitality the day after. But that could happen. But then pitch rate's also the other issue, right? If you over pitch, then the yeast doesn't have enough cell, right? It doesn't have enough sugar or nutrients available to it. And so it also struggles in that way. So, the whole point of pitch rate is pitching the right number of cells into the beer. And you get that by viability, right? And of course, viability can decrease with age.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have come up with a couple, I would say two main ways of making sure, when we talk about pitch rate, you kind of alluded to this, Cade, but when we talk about pitch rate, that is sort of a function of viability. Pitch rate is more in reference to the number of yeast cells added to a volume of wort. And there are very specific, recommendations out there, 0.75 billion cells per milliliters, all that stuff, right? And so, for a long time, for me at least, it's been the last, 15 years or so that I've really stuck by that pitch rate thing. You're going to hear this a couple of times in this episode. A lot of what we do with yeast is just taking out insurance. We want to do whatever we can to ensure that yeast is not going to putter out on us, that it's not going to produce undesirable off flavors. Is it possible to create a absolutely delicious, award-winning, world-class beer by under or over pitching it? Absolutely. It's been done. But a lot of people, or I would say most quality brewers, avoid going that route and take these extra precautions just purely to ensure that the yeast isn't going to be the issue if there are any issues. And it makes sense to me because it's not terribly difficult. Now, how do we go about improving viability? We've got this pitch of yeast. Let's call it Imperial Yeast A07 flagship, one of their most popular. It's been sitting in the fridge for 2 months, so we can kind of predict now that it's about 120 billion cells. We want to pitch 250. How do we do that? Well, one option is just to pitch 2 pouches, and that's what a lot of people these days seem to be doing. It's really interesting as someone who's been around this for as long as I have to watch the kind of trends that are happening. And what I'm seeing is people just pitching more yeast and not necessarily fussing around with starters, whereas just 10 years ago, everybody was making yeast starters. Now, when we talk about yeast starters, just in general, we are talking almost primarily about viability. You make these starters a couple days ahead of time, 24 to 48 hours, I'd say. You're just doing clean wort, no hops. You pitch your pouch of yeast into there, and then you let it spin and do its thing over that 48 hours or so. And in that process, basically what you're doing is forcing that yeast to go through its full growth cycle. It goes through the lag phase, it goes through the growth phase, it goes through fermentation, and it goes through sedimentation. That's the idea. Now you have increased the living cells within that population, so you have ostensibly increased the viability of that yeast pitch. And that is a good thing. You can now pitch the recommended or the proper, however you want to look at it, number of cells into the wort that you produced based specifically on the numbers of that wort. And what that means, I'm curious if you've ever heard this one. Somebody once gave me this analogy for the why we need to pitch the proper amount of yeast. That if you take 15 hungry, athletes and you take them to a pizza shop and all you serve them is one pizza, now you've got 15 hungry athletes who get one or two bites of a slice of pizza, and they're still hungry in the end. They're not doing their full job in satiating themselves. You could also take one or two guys and say, hey, you got to eat these 20 pizzas, and now they're going to overfill themselves. They're going to be sick. They're not going to feel good. That's sort of how it is with yeast. You want to pitch the right number of yeast to consume the sugars that are in the environment that you are pitching them into. You don't want it to be too low or too high. So have you ever heard that analogy before, Cade?
That's actually the first time I've heard that analogy, but I love it. I think that's better than my Vegas analogy.
They both make sense, though. Yeah, I think the Vegas thing is more vitality.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Vegas thing may impact vitality too. Yeah, but you're totally right. Most starters up to this point, or at least up until the last few years, have been talked about as growth, right, and propagation, and that's important, especially like if you think about commercial scale, right? You're going to start with a brick of yeast, or a liquid pitch from from a supplier, and then you're going to need to grow that up if you have more than a huge pitch, right? If you're pitching into 100 barrels, pitching 2 packs of yeast is not going to do anything for you, right? So this is important, and it's one of those things that's translated from commercial growers to home brewers, and it is super important. So making a vitality to grow yeast, or making a viability starter to grow yeast, is super important, so you can hit that pitch rate. But we often forget about this other aspect. Those yeast still need to be ready to go to do fermentation, right? So they still need to be vital. They have to have their ability to ferment the beer. So when we talk about, you mentioned vitality, and when we talk about, you mentioned viability. When we talk about viability, that's like the number of living cells in a given population. Well, vitality is the metabolic activity of the yeast. Are the yeast able to do their job and consume the pizza, for example, the athletes? Are they able to actually consume that pizza? And are they able to recover from that, right?
Yeah.
So if in the case of the athletes that overeat, no. Or in the case of the bachelor party that went way over in Las Vegas, no, they're not going to be able to recover and clean up all this other mess. I mean, I think back, there was a few weeks ago in the Brew Lab, there was an episode with John Palmer, and we were talking about beer maturation. And he said there's 2 parts of fermentation. Fermentation is attenuation, that's actually consuming the sugars and producing, alcohol and CO2. But then there's a whole maturation phase where the yeast cleans up its mess. And he gave a different analogy. I guess we're going to analogy bomb you on this episode. But his analogy was like the worker at the end of the week. Let's say, a worker has a stack of papers to get through during the week, and they've got to get through that papers. If it's the right amount of papers for them to do that week, they'll work from Monday to Friday. They'll get through all of the papers, and their desk is nice and clean whenever they go home for work, right? If they've got too few papers, then the worker's going to be done by Tuesday, and then they're just going to go screw around, and they're going to mess up. Who knows what they're going to do. But the overworked person has a stack of papers at the end of the week, and their desk is a mess. And then when it's 5 o'clock on Friday, they're going home, and it doesn't matter if they clean up, if they have stuff to clean up or more work to do or any of that. They're just done. They're leaving. And so this vitality is super important, right? That's just one worker. That's not talking about all the workers at the company. That's this one worker. Is it able to do its job? And so vitality is equally as important as viability. If you have a whole bunch of yeast that aren't vital, you're still going going to have a sluggish or maybe a terrible fermentation, and vice versa. If you don't have enough yeast, that's a problem too. So you have to think about this when you're thinking of starters in terms of both viability and vitality.
Yeah, when we first started talking about the whole vitality thing back in 2015, I know vitality is not anything unique to Brewlosophy. I do think that because of Colin Kaminsky, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, because of his introducing me to this concept, I do think it became more of a talked about thing. I'm not sure, how so or to what extent, but there was a lot of confusion about hold on a second. They both start with a V. They're kind of confused, they kind of sound like they might be the same thing. What are we referring to here? And the easiest way that I developed to think about it is that viability is in reference to a population. You are not going to isolate one single cell and say, oh, that is a very viable cell. Well, if it's alive, it's viable. If it's not alive, it's not viable. It's that simple. It's binary. Vitality refers to the strength, the preparedness, the ability to recover from stress of a single cell within a population. So, viability is kind of like the group. It's the commune. Vitality is each individual yeast cell that is alive within that commune. And that's the way I like to think about it, because they are very distinct. And in order for us to understand each, ideally, right, you're going to want to pitch the most viable cell, viable pitch with the most vital yeast within that pitch. That's the idea. But there is a little bit of wiggle room there. And this is where we kind of came in with this testing of vitality starters and such, is when Colin Kaminsky reached out to me back in 2015, and he sent the following text. He said, Coors England developed an amazing method that is perfect for homebrewers to steal. Take a stir plate and make a starter. Add yeast and 10-degree Plato, which is 1040 OG wort. Aerate for 4 hours, then pitch into the wort. Do not aerate the batch. This maximizes vitality, which is the most difficult to measure and important parameter in yeast. A standard starter is fermented out and then repitched. A vitality starter uses continuous air and only allows the starter to spin for 4 hours. No alcohol is produced. The yeast respires but does not enter fermentation phase until after it is pitched into the wort. So again, the idea here, and hopefully it's easy to see, is that we are not pushing this yeast into or beyond the lag phase. Really, it doesn't ever enter fermentation. It just kind of sits in this suspended animation, but it's ready to get going. And so you've forced this yeast. You think about a marathon runner. This is the marathon runner. Vital yeast is the marathon runner who is trained for months, who's stretched before. They wake up, they stretch, they have their energy drink, they're all nice and warmed up, and they're ready to hit the road. Compare that to the overweight, lazy person who gets thrown into a marathon. They're not going to be able to do it anywhere near as effectively as the person who did all the training and the stretching and all of that stuff. So.
Yeah, that's totally right. I mean, the yeast is staying in that lag phase, and it's important to understand what the yeast is doing in the lag phase. Lag phase is when the yeast is collecting all of its nutrients, right? So it's getting things set and primed. It's having its energy drink. It's stretching. It's making its machinery to be able to consume sugars. It's doing the things that it needs to do to get ready to grow. This is another thing that John Palmer told me in that episode on the Brew Lab about beer maturation, is that yeast doesn't give a crap about alcohol and CO2, right? It doesn't care about beer. It just wants to grow. That's what its job is, and that's what it's trying to do. So during the lag phase, it's collecting all of the nutrients and all the things that it needs to be able to grow, and then it starts to grow. And then in the growth phase, that's where we start to see all the cells doing this all at once, and then they start to go boom, 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 and it's an exponential growth, right? And yeast just replicates, fermentation occurs, and that's why fermentation happens pretty quick. But, it's interesting. One of the things that you had from Colin there was that he said that the yeast respires at that first part during lag phase. I'm not sure how much respiration actually happens. Respiration from yeast means consuming oxygen and using oxygen to generate energy, not fermentation, right? So those are two different metabolic pathways. And generally in a 1040 OG wort, yeast is not going to go down the respiration path very far, but they will still collect all of these nutrients, right? They'll collect nutrients. They'll be processing and doing a little bit of fermentation. That's why you might see a little bit of a drop. But then once growth starts to happen, that's when things really kick off, because growth takes a huge amount of energy. They're building an entire new cell, right? And like you said, it's like running the marathon. Prepping and, drinking your energy drink, stretching, and all that stuff takes a little bit of energy, but then running the marathon is what consumes the energy.
Right.
I really like that. And so this concept of a vitality starter is, let's pitch the yeast in their lag phase before they've reached the growth phase, before they've started consuming all of their energy. Let's pitch them in so that they're ready to go. It's basically like we're starting them at the starting line. Here you go. You can go ahead and run. They're like vital and viable. And I bring this up because one of the, I think, most interesting episodes from the Brew Lab is Maria Mutsoglu's low sugar starter, right? And in that case, she was talking about doing a starter which actually pushes the yeast into a respiration. So you're using a 1008 OG starter, a super low OG starter, right? Not 1040, 1008. And what that does is the sugar content is so low that it actually forces the yeast to respire. And during respiration, they store up a whole lot of energy. Now, I don't know if this works as a vitality starter. So that'd be something that would be interesting and maybe an experiment we can do in the future. It's definitely, in Maria's case, a propagation method. So she could grow up a whole bunch of yeast really quickly, and those yeast were super viable. They fermented faster. They completed attenuation more often than other yeast did. It was great, right? I don't know if that works in the same way of vitality, but when we talk about a vitality starter, we're not talking about growth. We're talking about just getting it to that lag phase so that the yeast are primed and ready. That's a super important point, and one that's really, I think, important to understanding that difference between vitality and viability. Vitality means the yeast is primed and ready to go. Viability means there's enough yeast to do the job.
Exactly. And if you can just break it down that simply and hold on to both of those concepts, you're going to get this quite easily. Now, just to break it down, how to make a vitality starter, what the method that I'm going to give you right here, very simply, it's even easier in my opinion than making a viability starter. But this method is for your typical 5-gallon batch. It's what Colin Kaminsky recommended that we do, and it's kind of what we've encouraged others who want to try this out do. So your mileage may vary. If you're doing vitality starters for a 7-barrel batch or a 40-barrel batch, I have to imagine that volumes are going to be a little bit different here. So, but for your typical 5 to 10-gallon batch, what you're going to do is at the end of making your wort on brew day, you're going to steal off a little bit of just remnant wort that's there, and then ideally what you would do is dilute that down with, say, fresh RO water or distilled water down to about 1040 OG, which is pretty common for even viability starters. That seems to be the sweet spot for most of the types of starters we're making as homebrewers. So you're going to take about 500 milliliters, that's a half a liter, for a typical 5 to 10 gallon batch. Again, you're going to let it spin on it. You're going to add the yeast to that, and then you're going to throw it on a stir plate, or you can do the shaken method if you want to. But what you want to make sure is that over those 4 hours, you are inviting in a lot of oxygen. You want as much oxygen in there as possible because you want that's a nutrient for yeast. After 4 hours, you just take that whole starter. You don't need to decant. I mean, it's only 500 mils. You don't need to decant it. You just pitch that right into your chilled wort and you're off to the races. It couldn't be any easier. And in that time, again, it's 4 hours. You are not encouraging yeast replication or growth by any means. What you're doing is prepping that yeast. You're telling it. It's like you're giving it the pep talk. Hey, look, this stuff that you're doing now, you're going to be doing a little bit harder in about 4 hours. So get ready to hit the ground running, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're taking it through its lag phase, right? Which I think is also one of the reasons why this works so well is because then the yeast doesn't have to go through a lag phase in a big volume, right? In a big volume of wort. It can go in a lag phase where there's a relatively small volume and a lot of access to nutrients. So you're taking it through its lag phase really quickly. And this is really awesome too because it's easy, right?
Yeah, it's so easy.
You've already made the wort. Just rack off a little bit of that wort into a flask or something, and then pitch your yeast. And like you said, put it on a stir plate or shake it every now and then to let it go. You're just priming that yeast and getting it ready. It's so easy. It can be done with real wort, like directly from the batch that you're going to ferment it in, which is awesome. Which is unlike a viability starter. You do it several days before. You're actually going to pitch that yeast. So that's going to be just probably DME, right? Like a dry malt extract or liquid malt extract. And so it's not going to be the wort that it's going into. So you're not getting the yeast ready to go directly into that wort, although it's still going to do it fine, right?
Yeah.
But you can use the real wort from the batch that it's going to go into. And again, it requires a lot less time and effort, which is nice. You don't have to plan it 3 or 4 days in advance. You can just, in my case, especially while the wort is chilling down to pitching temperature, because you can usually get the wort to like 10 or 15 degrees of pitching temperature, but then I have to put it over into my fermentation chamber and chill it the rest of the way down to my fermentation temperature. And that usually takes several hours. So during those several hours of chilling, I just throw my wort, throw a vitality starter on, and then I'm ready to go. If I'm not using imperial yeast, if I'm using fresh imperial yeast, I'm just going to pitch straight from the pouch.
Yeah, I mean, I tell you, there really are very few cons when it comes to making a vitality starter. The biggest one just being that it is an extra step, but it's such a simple step that it really, I mean, you don't have to have an Erlenmeyer flask. You can use an Nalgene bottle. You could use a leftover growler. It's so simple. And it's just another insurance that you're taking out to try to encourage that yeast to do what it is you want it to do. Now, as a professional brewer and co-author of the Water Book, I really did take Colin at his word when he was messaging me back, 7-8 years ago, especially since he shared the results of that Coors England experiment. Now, prior to doing our own experiments on them, I started using vitality starters anytime I was pitching yeast that was, older than about a month, because I figured why not? I had the gear, so I just went with it. And I never had a bad experience. Those beers always started fermenting very quickly. That was one of the biggest differences that I noticed is from pitching direct, is that if I pitched a vitality starter, I was getting bubbles in about 3 to 4 hours for the most part. So they would attenuate well, and they didn't have any notable off flavors. But again, that was just my personal anecdote. We were curious how using a vitality starter with old yeast would compare to pitching yeast of the same age directly into wort, and designed an experiment to test it out. Results from that when we're back from this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
When you need auto parts, O'ReillyAuto.com is just a click away. Order online and pick up at your local store. Visit O'ReillyAuto.com.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Before Shopify, were you wondering, where are my sales at? Now you're selling with Shopify, the global commerce platform supercharging your selling. You have no problem selling online, in person, on social media, and beyond. Gary, easy on the cha-ching.
Oh, sorry, but my Shopify sales are through the roof.
Start selling with Shopify today and discover how millions of businesses around the world use Shopify to ignite their selling. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
Like most, the first handful of batches I made were fermented with yeast pitched directly from the pack, regardless of, I didn't even pay attention to the age of the yeast when I first got started brewing. I just kind of trusted that it was going to be okay since I bought it from the shop. Well, I then learned about yeast starters and started making them for every single batch I brewed, usually a couple of days before brewing. After learning about vitality starters from Colin Kaminsky back in 2015, I started using those more and more often. And while my results seemed good enough, I often wondered just what the impact it was actually having on my beer. Well, a couple of years ago, contributor Mike Neville performed an experiment to see for himself.
Yeah, and this one was really cool. He used old yeast, right? And so this is, we're talking about vitality and what that means. It's getting the yeast primed and ready to go. We mentioned that viability is going to go down over several months, but also that yeast is just going to be like sitting in the pool of its, nutrients that were packed in there. So it's going to be kind of respiring. It's not necessarily like ready to go run a marathon. It's kind of sitting on the couch watching TV. So this one was really cool to me to think about. Like, okay, how can we do a vitality vitality starter with old yeast? And then will there still be those, what we would expect? Would there be, off flavors or negative results from using an old yeast, or can we sort of solve that by using a vitality starter? So this was cool. And Mike, of course, was brewing a 10-gallon batch. He chose English Porter as the style and split it into 2 5-gallon batches. So the malt bill was very nice English Porter, 76% Golden Promise, 10% Victory Malt, 5% Special Roast, 4% Crystal DRC, 3% Chocolate Malt, and 2% Black Patent Malt. He mashed at 154 Fahrenheit or 68 Celsius for 60 minutes. Then when the mash was complete, removed the grains and boiled for 60 minutes. And the only hops that he used in the batch were 56 grams of East Kent Golding at 60 minutes for the whole 10-gallon batch. So that's about 1 ounce, 28 grams in a 5-gallon batch. 2 ounces total for the 10-gallon batch. There we go, of East Kent Goldings. And then when the boils were complete, he chilled the wort and took refractometer readings, confirming that it was at an OG of 1049 OG. Then he split it into 2 identical wort fermenters, 2 fermentation kegs, and left it to finish chilling to the desired pitching temperature of 70 Fahrenheit or 21 Celsius.
Yeah. So you look at this beer just to start. You're using an English ale yeast, which we'll talk about the yeast that he used there in a minute. But he went with an English porter for this reason, right? You've got a fairly moderate OG beer, 1049. That's right now, kind of pushing that 1050 thing. You've got an English yeast. These are the types of yeast that are going. You expect to produce some amount of esters, some fermentation character, and so he also chose a slightly warmer, 1 degree Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit isn't huge. I wouldn't expect to notice a huge difference, but 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 2 degrees warmer than I think your average recommended fermentation temperature for English ale yeast. His idea being, let's push these yeast a little bit to see what they might produce at a little bit warmer. You might expect a little bit more ester development, and if it's stressed, you might expect even more off flavor development. Who knows? So I like the setup to this one. Nice English porter. At this point, they are identical, but we are at the time of introducing the variable. Now, what Mike did is he took both pouches of Imperial yeast. He had 2 of them from the same exact lot. They were produced in December of 2021, and they were just sitting in his fridge, and he brewed these beers in May of 2022. So these yeast pouches were 5 months old. Cade, total aside, I know, but what would you do if you had a 5-month-old pouch of yeast that you found sitting in the back of your fridge? I get that Imperial yeast is amazing and packaged 200 billion cells and all of that, but 5 months, maybe I'm old school. That's leaving me feeling a little bit wary about what's going to happen with this fermentation.
Yeah, for sure. I usually use 6 months as my cutoff. Anything that's older than 6 months, I'm probably just going to assume that it's dead and I need to go get new yeast for the most part. But 5 months is definitely on that edge. 5 months is the point where I'd kind of go, might work. Would
you for me, obviously I'm old school. I'd make a viability starter and just see if it picked up, because you can tell if you're especially if you're using an Erlenmeyer flask or like a clear beer growler, you're going to see fermentation relatively quickly because it's such a small volume. If you pitch that whole population, that whole pouch into a 1 liter starter, by the next day you're going to see bubbling. You're going to see, depending on the yeast strain, you should see some flocculation, especially if you're using AO9 Pub. But AO1 House is known for doing the kind of a similar thing as well. It flocculates quite quickly and it looks like egg drop soup. If I'm not seeing that after 24 hours, maybe a little longer if it's 5 months old, in the wort or on the stir plate, then I'm probably tossing it and just going to go buy some fresh yeast. But in this case, I love the setup, right? I don't even know if Mike intended to do this or if he just forgot about these yeast pouches and designed the experiment around that. But his idea was, okay, we know we can, with fair amount of confidence, we can predict that these pouches of yeast are quite a bit less viable than they were 5 months ago when they were first produced. So if I don't focus on viability necessarily, and we improve the vitality of one of these pouches while keeping the other one the same, are we going to see some differences? I just think it's a really nicely designed experiment.
Yeah, for sure. And again, this is a big deal, right? Like 5 months old, there's going to be the yeasts are not going to be very viable, but they're also not going to be very vital either. They've been sitting on the couch for 5 months. They're not going to be ready to go.
Been eating those Cheetos all for the last 5 months.
Right, exactly. So yeah, this was a cool experiment. I was excited to see can we fix some of those things by by doing a vitality starter. Can we get the yeast primed and ready to go? Can we kick it off the couch and get it stretching and getting ready to go by doing the vitality starter? So yeah, this was cool, and I like the experiment set up at this point. So of course, following the boil of the wort, he collected 500 mils of wort in an Erlenmeyer flask, then pitched one of the pouches of yeast into it and let it spin on a stir plate. And then after 4 hours, that vitality starter was pitched into one batch while the other received the pitch directly from the pouch. So this is the vitality starter concept, right? He used wort from the boil to pitch into yeast, let it go for about 4 hours, and then pitch it into the fermenter. So this is exactly what you would think with the vitality starter. Again, 5-month-old yeast, I'd be worried that you might not even get fermentation in the batch that was pitched directly from the pouch. But who knows? Do you think, Marshall, that the vitality starter would actually have an impact here?
Well, so here's the thing, right? The one thing that we can presume here, ostensibly at least, is that both of these pitches of yeast, those original pouches of AO1 House, had the same. Again, it's not going to be identical, but is about as identical as it can be, considering the fact they came from the same lot, had the same viability, which I did a calculation. If each of those yeast pouches started out with 200 billion cells, and we go with this rule of thumb about the 20% degradation month over month, we're looking at about 66 billion cells left in each of those pouches, which arguably is an underpitch for this 1049 OG wort, right? I think you would want to have somewhere closer to about 120 billion, give or take, and so we're not at a massive underpitch. That's more than enough yeast to do its job, but is it going to do it well? And this is why we were testing it. So now you're pitching 66 billion cells into one 5-gallon batch that is not vital either. So low viability and low vitality, and then the other one, it's low viability, but this higher. Again, ostensibly at this higher vitality, I think it's well designed. What I would expect from that, at the very least, is to see the vitality starter batch kick off fermentation much quicker than the other one. So that's more of an objective measurement. Now, are there benefits to that? I tend to think so, even if it just means that your beer is ready sooner. Are there flavor benefits and stuff? I really don't know. I guess on a kind of a grand scale, my expectation would be that if one of these beers is going to have a problem, it's going to be the low vitality starter version. That doesn't mean I think it's going to have issues though, only because I'm silly and I've direct pitched a lot of beers with lower vitality and viability yeast before in the past.
Yeah, or they're just both going to suck, right? The vitality starter is not going to do anything. That's an option too, right? You might see a situation where the fermentation just doesn't kick off at all, and in either batch, and then it's like, well, crap. Okay, the vitality starter wasn't able to revive dead yeast. But luckily, I think luckily that didn't happen for Mike. And so after he pitched the starter in one batch and the pouch in the other batch, he let them ferment at 70 Fahrenheit. 21 Celsius for 5 days before he took hydrometer measurements and showed that both batches had actually finished fermenting. They reached a 10-12 final gravity, which is pretty cool to see. It actually worked. So there was both batches fermented all the way down to full attenuation. So even like you said, that if there were 66 billion cells, that certainly seemed like enough to ferment. But I'm wondering what would happen with the vitality starter. Did it ferment better? Was the yeast more healthful? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, here's the thing. Back in the beginning of Brewlosophy, when we were all using like plastic or glass carboys, it was fairly easy to kind of observe, fermentation start times and stuff like that. Mike, not only does he use stainless steel conical fermenters, so you can't see the fermenting beer on the inside, I think he brewed this at a time where he was probably in bed when fermentation would be expected to start in both batches. So he wasn't really able to track, the starter fermentation terribly well. My hunch would be that the Vitality Starter beer did kind of kick off and had a slightly reduced lag phase compared to the other one, but who knows? I mean, not to sound like we're kissing their ass, but Imperial Yeast, they've got juju in that stuff. I don't know what they're doing, but it never seems to fail when I've used it. So maybe it's a function of just the quality of the yeast these days. But, at this point, the fact that they both finished at 1012 FG, which is what Mike expected based on his recipe design, that just indicates to me that, okay, the yeast did their job, but did they do it well? Did they produce, off flavor? Was the non-vital yeast producing these off flavors because of its higher stress and its unpreparedness for going in and fermenting that wort? Well, that's we're only going to see that when we serve it to blind tasters. So now when he was done with these beers, he did cold crash them to 38 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees C, left them overnight before pressure transferring each to separate CO2 purge serving kegs to avoid that nasty cold side oxidation. And then he left them in their keezer, burst carbonated them overnight, left them there another couple of weeks for conditioning until they were ready to serve to tasters. Now, I'm looking at the picture on the website right now, Cade, and to me, they look exactly the same. They have that nice reddish brown English porter color. When I think of an American porter, I think of inky black, but these just have that beautiful brown, red hued color to them. Good clarity, nice beige foam. Both of the batches have decent retention, at least based on the photo. They both have a nice cap of foam sitting atop them, which meant to me that stressed or the non-vital yeast wasn't producing these lipids that can really, that yeast stress byproduct that can really affect head retention. By the looks of it, they're the same beer.
Yeah, they look really identical, right? I mean, it's interesting that reddish brown color from an English porter. Yeah, I still think it could be a little darker, but that's just me. Right? That's why I think of whenever I think of porters, my American roots here. Yeah. But yeah, the beers look great. They're nice and clear. They have a reddish color. They have a good foam retention. Now, it would be interesting. You're right that like lipid production could be an issue for stressed yeast, but I'd be more interested to see about like esters and higher alcohols and what do they taste like. Because those are the kinds of things that I think stressed yeast would produce that might have a more lasting impact. But for certainly, the beers look identical. And so, at least from objective appearance, I don't see a difference so far.
Yeah, no, they look identical. So first question we ask is, as the brewer, Mike, are you able to tell these beers apart, knowing full well what the difference between these beers is, the fact that you brewed them, you've had your fingers in the process from start to finish? You would think that Mr. Bias himself would be able to tell these beers apart. And I'm not making fun of Mike. That's all of us whenever we're performing an experiment. To his palate, they tasted exactly the same. He said that out of the 5 personal triangle tests that he was served by probably his wife, that he only got 2 of them right, and that they were just wild guesses. He says the beers had a nice, pleasant, bready, and toasty malt flavor with hints of caramel and toffee. It was just bitter enough to balance the sweetness, and he really enjoyed drinking them. And they just tasted exactly the same to him. Now, we haven't gotten into the blind taster results. You can start making your presumptions now. If the person who brewed these, we tend to be our own worst critics, who is very well aware of the expected impact of, pitching less vital yeast, if he's unable to tell them apart, to me that says quite a bit. But our main focus is, of course, on the blind taster data. Why don't you tell us about that, Cade?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate Mike, and Mike certainly has a great palate. 2 out of 5 on the personal triangle test means he doesn't taste much in terms of significance. But what did the tasters say on this? And so we had 24 tasters in this experiment. We would need 13 to reach statistical significance, but only 9. So 38% of the tasters, which is just a little bit better than guessing. Probably 1 taster better than guessing, right? It actually is. 24 participants would be 8. Yeah, as I do that math in my head. But just a little bit better than guessing. The tasters could not reliably tell these beers apart, which I think is interesting, right? I mean, I would have hoped that a vitality starter might improve the flavor, or at least the have lower esters or other things, or maybe not have bad aspects of having a low vitality or low viability pouch that was pitched. But maybe this just means that the yeast pouch that was pitched was good enough. Like you said, 66 billion yeast cells might have been enough to go ahead and ferment these beers all the way to attenuation and not overly stress the yeast. And so maybe the Vitality Starter was better insurance against that, but the pouch worked in this case. I mean, who knows?
Who knows? Who knows what the real explanation is? All we can say is that tasters in this experiment were unable to reliably distinguish the beers. That doesn't mean we can make, assertions about why that is, that, Vitality Starters don't matter now. That's not what we're saying at all. In fact, just because the Vitality Starter didn't seem to have this noticeable, perceptible impact compared to the direct pitch, we know that both of those pitches were lower viability than unless, Imperial Yeast 200 billion cells is like a floor and that they're actually giving us way more than that. So the viability was still high. I don't think that's the case. I do, tend to have this bias toward Imperial Yeast and believing that they are giving us a lot of yeast cells that are incredibly healthy from the beginning. And so maybe that made up for some of that lack of vitality and viability. Who knows? But, often we get the question, well, then what are you going to do with these results? Hey, look, if I'm brewing a batch of beer and I'm using even if it's an Imperial Yeast pouch that's over 3 to 4 months old, it takes mere seconds to create a Vitality Starter. I don't see why I wouldn't do that purely for insurance sake. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Right. I mean, it seems, like I said, that could be that the insurance wasn't necessary in this fermentation, right? But there's a real outcome that yeast was 5 months old and it might have done a terrible job, right?
Yeah.
That's a real possibility there. And so by doing the Vitality Starter, you had the insurance, you just didn't need it in this case, which is kind of an interesting way to think about it, right? Did the Vitality Starter actually work? Of course, there's no way to know, and we're not able to tell by this experiment whether the Vitality Starter actually, was beneficial. We just know that it didn't result in a noticeable impact between the beers, like you mentioned, Marshall. But it could be, right? There's no reason not to go on with that insurance in the future if you're interested in doing that. It's such an easy step, just collecting a little bit of wort, in the fermenter, in a flask, and then pitching the yeast and letting it get started in the lag phase.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll tell you what, I mean, how fortunate are we as brewers in this day and age to have access to such high quality yeast? I mean, whether it's from Imperial, Y Yeast and White Labs and Omega Labs and Giga Yeast, all of these labs are producing just the highest quality yeast that we've ever had available to us. We are so lucky. I mean, that we don't have to worry about these things nearly as much as we used to 20 years ago. I mean, I got into brewing after the whole, yeast, tiny little yeast pack underneath the lid of the extract can. I never had to deal with that. But I'll tell you that when the first few batches I made were made with vials. I believe they were from White Labs. I think they were the only ones who ever used those preform vials. And, who knows how old they were? Who knows how low the viability was? Certainly, if I was pitching it direct, they weren't vital yeast. So just the fact that we have access to this high quality, high viability yeast that we can push into high vitality as well, I just think it's rad. I feel very fortunate to be brewing in this day and age as it is. But we do have some reader comments to get to. Kyle M says, I'm not surprised by the results of this experiment. To my mind, pitching yeast into a small amount of, quote, side-streamed identical wort from the same brew prior to pitching it into the main volume of wort is fundamentally the same as direct pitching into the fermenter, excluding any possible temperature discrepancies. Now, I could see it making a difference if we were talking about using diluted wort to make the starter, as discussed on the Brew Lab episode 62. That's the impact of nitrogen on yeast propagation with Dr. Maria Mutzoglu. Now, I will say this, when we started talking about Vitality Starters back in the day, there was a lot. It seemed like these homebrew forums were a lot more active than they are today, with people kind of getting into the weeds of all of this stuff. And I recall somebody commenting, well, what's the difference? Why pull a small amount of wort to build this Vitality Starter? Wouldn't it just do the same thing if you pitched it into the whole batch? Because it's only going to work on the sugar that's there anyways. So if you're not changing anything, really, what difference does it make? I mean, I'm not a microbiologist, so I don't know. These are those types of things that I usually just kind of take other smarter people at their word on. But that question kind of makes sense to me, so I can see where Kyle's coming from as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can speculate. Again, I'm not a microbiologist either, so take that for what it's worth. But I can speculate that because you're aerating this, right? You're spinning it or shaking it pretty regularly. That aeration means that there's going to be a lot more oxygen that yeast is able to come into contact with, right? Aerating a batch or shaking or spinning a batch that's 20 liters is going to get a lot less oxygen in solution, right? And yeast needs that oxygen for growth. Another Brew Lab episode where we talked with Lance Shaner about using olive oil as a fermentation nutrient. Yeast can't replace oxygen when they're making their cell walls, so they have to have oxygen. And so that Vitality Starter gives them easy access to all of the nutrients that they need really quickly, versus putting it into a 20 liter or 5 gallon situation where they've got to sort of like bump around. There's more water in there. Maybe not more water, but there's just more space for them to diffuse around. So maybe it makes sense to me that there's a little bit more access to nutrition and a little bit more access to oxygen, especially during that Vitality Starter, and maybe that's what kicks them off a little bit faster in that lag phase.
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. It's probably better than mine, actually, because you are actually in school for this stuff.
Not microbiology, and I'm in the school for brewing chemistry. Biology.
Well, hey, that's still one step further than my, homegrown version of this stuff. But another comment comes from Eric Webster, who says, Vitality Starters seem a lot more like a tool to reduce brewer anxiety rather than a tool to make better or faster beer. They make you feel like you've done everything you can or are supposed to, but with modern yeast, it seems like an outdated technique. I just want to say something. The fact that we're calling a technique that's been around for 7 years outdated already makes me feel a little weird. But also,
right.
Again, I get what he's saying. And I think Eric put it much more clearly for the typical, common brewer than I did by calling it insurance. I mean, insurance really is just a way to reduce brewer anxiety, is it not? I mean, that's kind of why we do it. And what if? I mean, there's this constant threat of what if something were to happen. Well, if I can do this 5-minute thing, 4 hours and 5 minutes, we should say, but if I can do this real quick and just kind of reduce that anxiety, maybe it's worth it in the same way, that placebos for some people are worth it. I don't know, I have to imagine some good can come from doing it though,
Oh, I mean, we always use insurance. We do insurance in everything that we do. One of the main insurances that we use as brewers is sanitation, right? You can
Yes.
not sanitize your equipment, and you might make good beer, but you might make bad beer occasionally. And so everybody has different levels of anxiety and different things that they think are important or outdated or useful, right? I mean, we started off in the feedback of this episode talking about how short and shoddy it impacted Tim's life, or Tom, I think his name, maybe Tom was his name, but how it impacted his life, right? I mean, that's kind of, I think, like the extreme example of going without insurance. You can still make really good beer without insurance, but some things we do just because it helps us as brewers, right? Or it makes it better. Or we think it makes the beer better more often. And again, if you repeated this experiment 100 times, we might get different results. I don't know. This is one data point. We always say that with experiments. This is one data point, one beer that was brewed with a Vitality Starter and old yeast. If we tried this 100 or 1,000 times, we might get something different. So you never know. It is really interesting to think that this is an outdated technique already, because like you, Marshall, this was not around when I started brewing. We definitely didn't use Vitality Starters. It was the traditional viability starter that was being propagated. The starter method being propagated. Not just the propagation of yeast, but yeah, the Vitality piece of this was new, and so it makes me feel a little old thinking about Vitality Starters being outdated. But again, this is all about personal preference and what you want to do to have the best, most consistent fermentations. And if a Vitality Starter is, again, it's easy for me to do, so I don't even think about it anymore. It's just something that I do when I'm pitching old yeast, or not pitching directly from a pouch, especially. But to each their own, and every brewer can do what they want. There's a lot of brewers out there that still, mash for 60 minutes and boil for 90 minutes and follow extended lagering techniques because it works for them, and that's totally okay.
Yeah, I agree. And here's the deal. If you're a lazy brewer and or a bigger risk taker, then maybe, if you've got 6-month-old pouch of yeast sitting in your fridge and you make a beer that's, let's say sub 1065 OG, then pitch your yeast and accept the potential, for off flavors. Who knows? Chances are, I would contend chances are you're going to get away with it. You're going to produce a perfectly drinkable, fine beer. As that OG goes up, though, I would imagine your risk taking, your propensity for that is going to go down a little bit. You might want to start considering doing something as simple, at least, as making a vitality starter, at least to make up for a little bit of that lack of viability. That's just the way I think about it. But that's just me again. So that is all the time we've got on using vitality starters with old yeast. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Cade?
No, I think we covered it. This is a great one. Again, if you can keep in mind that vitality and viability are different concepts, you're doing a great job, and go from there whenever you're looking at what kind of starter it is that you want to do. That's, I think, the main takeaway from this episode. Think about that difference between viability and vitality and choose which one is important for your brewing process.
Yeah, very well said. Now, don't forget to check out the Brew Lab, where Cade takes you into the lab to discuss the fascinating research folks like Dr. Maria Mutsoglu are doing on brewing and beer. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.